Yes, there he is, Mr. Adam Apollo on his spaceship on the bridge of the Starship something. And
Good evening.
I have to say, and you want to say something about him too, right, Joan? But I think Adam is perfect for this conference. His understanding of advanced technologies, ET consciousness, the integration into the current Earth plane paradigm is exactly the kind of pieces of this puzzle that we need to learn about in order to see what the bigger picture is. So I'm really appreciated Adam's really hardcore research. Very good, Adam. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alan. It's a
Well
pleasure to be here.
said, Alan. I think
Yeah.
you're a galactic ambassador, Adam. So it's so exciting to have the ambassador speaking to us.
Che c'è in Italia.
Little alien language there. Thank you. All right. What specifically you want to like zoom into today?
Yeah, so today, I just thought, hey, galactic tech, planets, races, this is all my stuff. So
Exactly.
I love getting into these things. And I really like providing a sort of grounding rod energetically and elementally to help people actually practically grasp the nature of what we're talking about and to be a bit of a bridge between the world and science and physics and metaphysics and connecting the dots a little bit for people between these different fields, and landing things in a way that sometimes channeling can be difficult to do. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Great. Okay, take over the spaceship. Go for it.
fantastic. Thanks
Drive us
for
out there
assigning
into
me to the
space.
bridge. Appreciate it
Yes.
as always. Thanks for having me, Neil. Good to see you, Alan. Good to see
Thank
you.
you.
Right on. Well, I'm going to just drop right into a presentation here in a moment, but I wanted to just put a little bow around something I heard Sarion sharing about, which was the question that Neil brought, which is, how do we deal with the nature of advancing in technology and being a planetary species and the fears that arise with that? And it's a big deal to talk about because I literally just did a talk earlier today inside of the Freedom Portal for the Thrive and Thrive 2 community with Foster Gamble, who's an old friend of mine and supported a lot of Nissim's early work and our work in the Resonance Academy. And it was an absolutely epic conversation where we went through all of these different layers of technological evolution for education in particular. And there happened to be just one person in the chat who was expressing a lot of fear about transhumanism and AI and whether, the metaverse is going to take and absorb all our consciousness and we're going to lose connection to the planet. And so I want to start this talk by saying that for me, understanding our technological development is about taking the mirror that it offers us in terms of our evolutionary potential as a species and as beings. I often say a hammer can kill and a hammer can build. And that's a quick way of talking to the nature that every piece of technology can be used for good or bad means. And the reality is that, if we just looked at the art of controlling fire as bad, or the creation of vehicles as bad, or the creation of airplanes as bad, or the creation of the internet as bad, we wouldn't be here right now. You wouldn't be able to listen to me. We wouldn't be in a conversation. We wouldn't be connecting without these developments. And as we move into planetary stewardship, it's very important that we look at and recognize how can technology actually support and augment our ability to be in service to nature, to the ecosystems of the planet, to how we collaborate and coordinate and peacemake together. And I think that this lens is essential as an opening to this exploration of galactic technology, because essentially what we're looking at is what it means to become planetary stewards and become part of a civilization that is full of stewardship of different worlds, caring for all life, and truly showing up with our hearts in service to all life together. So with that, I will go ahead and drop us in here and bring us into my presentation. And as I mentioned today, I'm going to focus on galactic technology, planets, and races. And in particular, going to spend about the first half of my presentation really bringing you into what does galactic starship technology really look like and how does that operate? So I'm going to do a little physics review, a little look at our exploration and science on Earth around this tech, and then open the door to the actual technologies used by different galactic species that has been shared with me and many, many of my colleagues and friends who have done that kind of deep work of exploration. So how do we go to space now? And what is it that makes people think that it would take forever to get to other worlds? And what is it that made Stephen Hawking say, there's no way extraterrestrial species have visited us. It would take too much time and energy, and they'd have to go across, these vast distances. Well, here's the problem. We're basically pushing pencils through the fabric being space-time itself. As we accelerate with a rocket, essentially riding a bomb exploding behind us, we are creating gravity, and gravity is literally the curvature or distortion of space-time. And so as space-time bends around these objects that we are attempting to accelerate, we're essentially dilating space-time, which creates time dilation issues. Have you ever heard the story of someone trying to accelerate to get to Alpha Centauri and back? If they accelerated, even if they sped up to near the speed of light, or let's choose an even further location. Let's say it's the Pleiades, 400 light years away. Even if they sped up to almost the speed of light, by that acceleration process, by getting there, even if it took them, a few days or months or years or hours, and then a few years to get back, on Earth, 800 years would have passed. And that's the nature of time dilation and why it's such a huge problem in looking at space travel. And it also means that as you warp space-time, you're requiring more and more and more energy as you're bending that fabric of space up to literally infinite energy it takes to accelerate up to the speed of light. So this just doesn't work. And so the approach and the thinking of a lot of physicists is that because of general relativity and because of this, you can't get there. You can't jump to other stars. That being said, there are some mainstream approaches that are now known that have been in the works for a long time, looking at other ways you could get around this solution. But essentially, even with the NASA condoned Alcubierre warp drive, what we're essentially doing is contracting space-time, again, distorting space, pulling it into contraction in front of us, and expanding space-time out behind us, increasing the distance from where we started. And so the idea is that if you pull the location you're trying to get to closer to you and you expand the space behind you, then you could actually possibly achieve these sort of transwarp speeds or above speed of light movement. But again, it's very mechanically trying to pull and push and distort the fabric of space-time in order to accomplish this. That being said, there's huge amounts of money, resources, and ideas that have got into this idea. And as you can see here, a community of NASA and Harold White and others did this whole rendering of a proof of concept of this spaceship, trying to raise more money for NASA, bring more attention to NASA projects, although nobody, as far as I know, is actually working on this thing, really technically building it. But I want to point out a couple things. Note the rings on this object. That's going to be a really important piece of some of the technological discussion that we move to a little bit later. So from there, I want to go into what does it really mean to engage this kind of capacity, to travel to another star system that is across the galaxy, that's hundreds or thousands of light years away? Well, it really comes down to the skill of space-time engineering. And when you start to actually understand what it means to engineer the fabric of space, in other words, to change the structure and flow of space-time, then all kinds of really interesting technological doors open. I'm not going to talk about them today, but I often speak about new energy systems and also replication and the capacity to duplicate materials and resources, which are two other pretty critical galactic technology transitions that can arise through understanding what makes up space-time itself, how does matter emerge from it, and how can we work with that matter. So traditionally, we've had this sort of idea of anti-gravity popularized by different researchers over the years. Back in the 50s and the 80s, Herman Bondi and Robert Forward talked about the idea of a negative gravitational mass propulsion system. Now, it's been generally theorized by most physicists that anti-gravity is impossible except under contrived circumstances. In other words, when you're able to actually somehow create a negative mass experience. And what is negative mass? Negative mass would be literally reversing the gravitational curvature that exists around an object, so that essentially it is not pulling space-time around it, but instead pushing against space-time. And there's some, sci-fi work around this. We see it in the red matter in Star Trek from 2009. And there has been foundations looking at and studying some of the different mechanisms that could lead towards this kind of approach. There have also been breakthroughs in understanding the relationship between light and space-time. The resonance cavity thruster, for example, by the work of Roger Scheuer with his M drive in 2001, and then Guido Feda with the Cannet drive, essentially it's a closed cavity that simply has microwaves vibrating inside of it. And the microwave patterns essentially created thrust in the object, but with nothing expelled. Literally, there's no jets coming out. There's nothing pushing against the air. It's actually inside of this closed conic-like container. They have a standing wave pattern of light, and this light pattern has been proved to interact with the quantum vacuum. In other words, the structure of space-time itself, and that can create movement. And this is a really important breakthrough for general physics because it says, oh, like light and space-time can talk to each other, right? Like all it takes is certain patterns of light waves, and gravity, in other words, the structure of space will move in response to that. We call that magnetic hydrodynamic forces acting against quantum vacuum fluctuations. I already mentioned the warp drive, the Alcubierre drive, contracting space in front of a craft and expanding it behind a craft. Another approach to this is called field resonance propulsion. That essentially is work by Alan Holt suggesting that if gravity has a waveform, maybe there's a way to interact with the gravitational waves in spacetime. Now, with projects like the Laser Interferometer Space Antenna, we've been looking at measuring gravitational waves at large scale coming from stellar objects and from galaxies and things like that. But as other researchers and those of us in the unified physics space have approached this task, we actually have started to theorize that gravitational waves could be literally so subtle that around your body, you have gravitational waves being propagated from your physical body, and that these very subtle gravitational waves essentially follow the architecture of space-time itself, i.e. the ether, i.e. chi and ki and prana, vital force, odic force, all of these terms that refer to the biofield of life force are actually the interaction of our being with the structure of space around us. And that if we could measure gravitational waves at extremely subtle levels, we would actually be able to render the entire structure of the human energy body effectively. So the progress in those different areas really, to me, led up to this, which is, I think, the actual key. It matches a lot of the galactic tech I've been shown over the years. And essentially, The idea here is that what you want to do is create a resonance between the frequencies of structures in light and the structure of gravity and space-time itself. In other words, a way that light can interface with the way that space-time is constructed. Now, there are certain challenges to this idea raised by some of the people that have studied this area, which is the idea of trying to essentially use unidirectional ring lasers and create a massive frame drag in space-time to literally open up a wormhole and essentially create a bridge between 2 points in space. And they get into all kinds of theoretical issues with this, like traveling to the past or traveling to the future, that you could do time travel and that there could create all of these problems and closed time-like curves and things like that. And the beauty of the heart of this kind of insight into the light connecting with space-time devolves a bit into a lot of different other issues that are literally just focused around essentially the idea that we could really screw up space-time and time travel accidentally or create major problems with that. Now, there are actually other ways we can look at this, which is to say, well, what if we're not trying to create a portal through space-time to a past or to a future, but instead just creating a resonance with space-time that's controllable around an object? So in my physics work, I traveled down this pathway in all of my work since I was a teenager, looking at the structure of space-time and assessing what is the geometry of space-time itself. What is the structure of this underlying discrete fabric that Lee Smolin and the loop quantum gravity guys proved back in the 80s, and that people like Nassim Haramein have proposed different solutions for over the years? How does this geometry actually form? What is it? How does it work? And how can we leverage that to actually travel through space? So some of the realizations I'm going to share with you down this path are both my work in the physics space, as well as a result of my experiences in eventually realizing that this is also exactly how different galactic species and star nations understand the simplicity of their relationship to the universe and apply that to creating technologies that can leverage that simplicity and interact with it. So in brief, I'll just say that space-time is always trying to find equilibrium. Now, there really isn't anywhere in our local space-time, at least in our galaxy, that actually is in equilibrium. It's all slightly out of equilibrium, and that out of equilibrium state enables the curvature that gives rise to mass, gravity wells, and et cetera. But essentially, if there was nothing, if there was no matter, if there was literally no stars, no planets, no galaxy or whatever, what we would generally have is this tetrahedral hexagonal scalar lattice that's perfectly even and in equilibrium going out into infinity forever. And this is the geometry that Nassim Haramein in his work and a lot of the Resonance Science Foundation has focused on, because it essentially is the generalized state of space-time without gravity. It's the generalized state of space-time without mass. It's space-time in equilibrium. But in the physics work that I've brought to that community, I show that essentially, in order to have curvature and in order to have gravitation and understand gravity, we have to understand how space-time bends and curves. And you can't exactly do that from inside of that particular format. So I use a very simple way to teach this, and I'm going to give you guys the key to it so that you understand both why certain geometries we point to are so-called sacred, but also how actual structure of space-time works, and then how that can be applied to advanced technology. The idea here is that everything is in vibrational tensegrity. Vibrational tensegrity essentially it comes from the word tensegrity is Buckminster Fuller's work, where you have an equal push and a pull between 2 points within a structure. Triangulation, of course, is also essential to this. But in what we're talking about is the literal fabric of space-time itself being made up of an energetic lattice of Planck spherical units vibrating into each other's space, a lot like these circles you're seeing overlap here, where there is an attractive bond pulling them together and a state of radiative vibration or radiation pushing them apart. And that pull and that push is just equal enough that everything tries to stay in perfect vector equilibrium. Everything tries to stay in equilateral, triangular, tetrahedral format. So how do we get from this equilateral flat plane and empty space to the curvature that creates gravity, that creates planets, that creates protons, etc.? Well, it's actually pretty simple. You take this structure and you take one node in that hexagonal lattice and it moves out. And that movement out is essentially radiation. And when some Planck spherical unit within some place in space-time moves out of a position, the rest of space in that area rotates to fill the space. And that rotation creates this pentagonal vortice towards the center of whatever is causing this curvature in space-time in the first place. And those pentagonal vortices, as we know from Buckminster Fuller's work, actually create the points that enable the curvature of this hexagonal lattice. Can you see how between each of these pentagonal points, there is a hexagon? In other words, 6 triangles in all of those spaces going in a circle, where in these intersections, there's 5 triangles, and that's creating this curvature. Well, for me, this was a huge breakthrough to realize that the pentagram and pentagonal structure allows for this curvature. Because in my earliest realizations back in high school, when I was developing the unified harmonic matrix, I realized that this same geometry, the pentagon, this symbol, the pentagram, in fact, represents the vibrational geometry of our root chakra. So if we think about what is it that our root chakra does, it engages us with the physical world. It enables us to have physical experience. So how does it do that? It plugs us in with the exact geometry that makes gravitation and mass so that we can actually interface with matter. In other words, all the objects in front of you, the computer, your headset, all of these things exist because of mass. In other words, because of protons. And protons create the core of atoms. They are really, truly the heart of what an atom is. And they bond together in different ways to form different kinds of structures and elements and molecules and et cetera. But literally all of our physical experience comes down to our experience of protons and mass and the way that protons are a dynamic. So what if the same geometry that gives rise to space-time curvature or gravity could also be used to dynamically adjust the curvature of space? In other words, to dynamically adjust gravity. Well, this is where we start to lead into an understanding of Starship technology. And I had another bridge come up for me from my work in the unified harmonic matrix, but that I didn't understand for many, many years later until I was working in the Resonance Academy for Unified Physics and developing and deepening my study of gravity control and the structure of space-time. And that is essentially the geometry of the sacral chakra. The sacral chakra being this state of equilibrium, hexagonal lattice designed to literally plug into space-time in its state of equilibrium and how light moves and flows through space-time itself. And so what if the geometry that's connected to equilibrium in space could be used to remove space-time curvature and actually enable space to go back into its regularized state or equilibrium state and create some kind of boundary condition where you have a standard space-time gravitational field inside of an area, but it is in a sense, in equilibrium state from the area outside. In other words, there's a boundary condition or an event horizon separating the inside of something like a spacecraft from the outside of that spacecraft. Well, this goes a lot deeper because as I worked with Robert Grant, realized there was tons of incredible mathematical relationships between the 5 and the 6 as this sort of fundamental dynamic between gravity and mass, which is making protons, curvature of space, et cetera, and our physical experience, and electromagnetism, states of equilibrium in space-time, which is essentially the flow of vibration through space or our emotional experience. And it went deeper because I, of course, have been traveling to Egypt and visiting different sites for many, many years and exploring some of the ancient wisdom and technology of these sites. And my friend Alan Green, who is working with Robert and I in Crown Sterling and the encryption project, essentially showed definitively that the bent pyramid is actually a perfect rendering of this relationship between the pentagram and the hexagram. And that is that the top portion of the bent pyramid is exactly the triangle that forms the pentagram. And the triangle portion at the bottom of that pyramid is part of a perfect equilateral triangle, which, you know, the original, the guys, the archaeologists, they say this is an accident, that they actually meant to build an equilateral triangular sized pyramid that should have been 220.617 cubits. And the accidental height is exactly 200 cubits, right? So, and perfectly matches these geometries. So there was a state of knowledge and wisdom about the potency of the way these geometries interact and intersect existing back in the time when the bent pyramid was constructed, which I postulate is not during the Egyptian dynasties. I highly recommend you guys check out Alan Green's work because there's so much more to explore here in terms of the roots of the relationships of the foot, cubit, and meter to these geometries and structures, the nature of spheres and cubes and their relationship, and the magic of Shakespeare's work, which actually encodes a lot of this knowledge in a way that is just absolutely mind-blowing and phenomenal. So please check out Alan. That's my little plug for him because I used a couple of his images and slides. And essentially, I'll take you to one more piece before we actually can understand the full way that these Starship technologies and engines work. And that third piece is the third stage, the solar plexus chakra, the mentality field, and that is the geometry of the heptagram, the 7-pointed star. And the heptagram is very, very powerful and particular in certain ways because each of its decimal points that go off of the different angular degree areas all have this 714215 pattern going off into infinity. They all have a particular dynamic. You can't actually make the 7-pointed star in equilibrium. And in fact, it's impossible to draw one absolutely perfectly, but you can get close. And essentially, this structure is about defining change and vector momentum in space-time. And so if we look at the 7, we can also see it as a relationship of spin and radiation. You can look at it as the connection between one pentagonal intersection and another pentagonal intersection and the sort of vibrational spin that's passing through the field. And one way to look at that is just anytime you have a lattice that's hexagonal, 6, as we were looking at before, if you try to shove a 7th point in there, it won't go. It literally will push a ripple through space-time. And so in a way, this represents a communication to space-time in terms of what information and mass and energy can exist within a particular location. So what we do is we tie these 3 geometries together, and we suddenly see that now what we have are the fundamental geometric mechanisms for the understanding of gravitation, of equilibrium or 0-point spacetime, and states of spin and radiation communicating to space-time. In other words, how do we position ourselves when we travel faster than light? And so if we triangulate each of these three geometries, essentially you get 3 5s, 3 6s, and 3 7s, forming this 15, 18, and 21 structure, which also happens to match the geometric structures in the unified harmonic matrix for the throat, third eye, and crown. And, you know, as we say, biomimicry is the best, right? If it follows the natural flow structure of energetics that create life, then you're probably on the right track in terms of your technological development. And that idea is, of course, shared by a lot of the different galactic communities out there. So essentially, we apply this 15, this 18, and this 21, these triangulated systems to essentially develop a ring system that allows the production of internal ship gravitation in the inner ring, the negation of the surrounding gravity well, in other words, the equilibrium state that the ship needs to be in to not be pulled around by a planet's gravity and that mass, or the solar mass, or the galactic mass as it's traveling through these different massive pools, swirling, moving pools of space-time that exist around planets and stars. And then a third outer ring that essentially is designed to communicate to space-time the position of the craft. So you can imagine that wherever you're located in space, you're here and you're relative to other points and places around you. And that is your position. You know where you are relative to your screen and, you know, the window and the objects around you in your space. And you are essentially triangulated between those spaces. Now, if you go somewhere else, you go outside, you've now moved to a new triangulation. And we're generally receiving that information from space as to where we are, how we're positioned, and how we're perceiving the rest of space-time. But what I'm getting at here is that this kind of tech is actually about communicating using light to space-time, a new location or a new position. In other words, if the craft has this 0-point envelope around it, if it communicates a new position, it can just be there. So I'll unpack that just a little bit more here in a second. But let's also just take a moment and note that almost all of these ships that we see, especially all these saucer ships, they all are designed in a particular way that seems to very, very well illustrate the usefulness of this kind of ring system, a system that essentially is designed to create a field around a particular area of a craft. Even NASA's little, warp drive mock-up is using 2 ring systems essentially as the suggestion of what could possibly expand space behind the craft and contract space in front of the craft. So maybe these guys are on the right track a little bit with this. So let's take the cutest one of these little UFOs in my image here and essentially render how this ring system works. So you've got your internal ship gravity ring, your 0-point space-time ring, and your superliminal positioning ring. And each of those is going to provide a field around the craft. Now, a lot of craft also have atmospheric, sonic, ultra-low frequency propulsion, essentially just recognizing that if you vibrate a membrane just right, you can hit a resonant frequency with a pressure field of air or off of a surface. And if you really master that, you can actually use that for lift and control. And there are actually scientific projects that show that the right level of sonic frequencies can be used to lift objects and move them through space. And essentially a very, very high level, very precise and refined version of this could be used for craft to come into atmosphere, come down close to the ground, land, do kinds of geometric, vibrational, holographic imprinting on objects such as crops, for example, especially if you have this kind of sonic propulsion device also synced up to a laser holography system. You could essentially design different geometric imprints and then use a series of light waves with sound waves to actually drive the matter into a particular position and create a crop circle. So that's basically what we see happening all over the place. So how does it happen that this thing is able to jump? So basically, you've got this internal consistent space-time. So on the ship, you're walking around, you're eating, you're drinking, you're hanging out, and you're outside of a certain planet, let's say Earth. And then what happens is you spin up the positioning system and you triangulate information to space-time that is actually the position of the space above another planet somewhere else across the galaxy. And what happens is, because the ship is not pushing through space, it has its own literally boundary condition or event horizon separating space inside from outside. That ship can then exist in that new spot. It's not that, you know, it has to fly there and travel and accelerate and go through this thing. No, it's literally, it just jumps and it is there. It is now as if space-time just says, oh, this object is located in this position. Okay, here it is. And this is the way that this information structure of space actually operates. Now, just take a moment here, because we could go a lot further, but I want you to consider for a moment the impact of a technology on a civilization in which you can literally exist in any other point in space-time across the entire galaxy of, like, we're talking, you know, 200 billion stars and hundreds and billions of planets, and you could just be there in a moment. Imagine that you had that on Earth. What would happen to our capacity to exchange goods, to ship things? We would no longer need all the semi trucks, all, you know, driving across the country all the time, all these highways, all these roads and stuff. No, I mean, you're literally talking about, you go out, you get in your ship and you go up into a clearance point, you jump, and now you're, you know, over Hawaii. And so your friend who's having a party on the beach today, you get up in the morning and you do everything and work and everything at home in the morning in New York City. And for the afternoon, you go jump over to Hawaii and you're hanging out with your friends. I mean, it literally changes the way we think about time, the use of time, you know, the difficulty of being with each other physically, the difficulty of traveling to see each other. I go to Costa Rica sometimes to visit friends with land projects and impact projects that I'm tracking down there. And essentially, it's such a pain because there's the fly, there's the whole airport thing, and then there's like difficult to rent a car, and you got to get in a shuttle and you got to drive for 4 hours or 8 hours sometimes across these bumpy roads to get to places. And we're talking about literally redefining our use of time and our access to resources and our access to space. Think about the human population. It's not that we need any depopulation. We just need to be able to develop the capacity to be stewards of our planet, care for our planet, and be responsible enough to travel to other worlds and engage with other planets and allow humanity to sort of expand out into the universe. So that's just a few bits to think about on that front. And essentially what I've broken down here is some of the keys to what it takes to build a superliminal spacecraft. And there are a series of other keys that I won't get into today because it's not the main topic of the conversation. But essentially you have a generator, life support, gravity drive, atlas, comm system, navigation. And there are particular technologies either in development already or well progressed or completed that map to each one of these sectors. And I think it's important to look at what it looks like for us as a species to make this transition to becoming a galactic civilization in order to understand better how other civilizations have done it and how easy it is for them to come visit us and experience us. And one of the big questions I often get on this front is about interstellar navigation. So it's the question of, all right, if I'm going to jump across the galaxy, how am I going to triangulate my position? How am I going to not end up in a star? How am I going to know where I'm going? Well, it's true that with a lot of stars, the stars are going to be evolving over time. Now, not necessarily that fast, but if you're looking at 1,000 light years away, that star that you're looking at that's 1,000 light years away has aged 1,000 years. When you look at the Pleiades, you're actually seeing the light that left those stars 400 and something years ago. So each star has a particular spectra, and these stellar spectra are actually like information maps of what the star is made of and how the star is evolving. Now, even though most stars have a very, a changing stellar spectra that changes sort of more swiftly as they age and as they go through changes. Even still, we're talking about, in the range of, millions of years, really, in most cases, and hundreds of thousands of years for fairly considerable changes. They're still changing and they are moving around the galaxy. We can project, based on our location, the movement of a lot of the stars that we can see, but we still need something really, really stable as a navigation unit to use. Well, the answer is pulsars. Pulsars have a very, very particular pulse rate of X-ray radiation that's blasting out of them at a very consistent timing. And that rate, these things literally act like lighthouses across the galaxy because they provide these very, very consistent stellar spectra with a very persistent and consistent pulse rate. And we know exactly how fast that pulse rate is going to change over time. And if we can track the position of the pulsar, then we have a perfect object to use in our triangulation with other objects to locate a specific energy in a particular point in space-time and be able to jump to that position in space-time. All right, so that's how we do it. That's how we get here, and that's how they do it. So let's look a little bit more into our galactic community and connections and how we can learn more about other species and what are the scientific approaches to that, and how can we get to know them, and how can we get to know these aspects of ourselves, because a lot of us actually have come from these other worlds. And that is one of the keys to beginning to understand our galactic relationships, and not only how they live, how they work, what their technology is like, but what parts of that world that is the future of Earth is actually already embedded inside of us. I spent many, many years finding my star family. And initially, I just thought they were soul family of mine from lifetimes on Earth, until around 2005, when I had a galactic contact experience and I met ambassadors of species from across the galaxy, and absolutely changed my whole perception of what was true for me and what was true for all of these people that I'm connected to. A lot of my work with that, I had to ground and find a mechanism to define and better understand this work. And that came through a lot of this spontaneous experiential recall, which essentially I began to frame in the terms of transpersonal psychology. And these spontaneous recalls would just happen with me and other people, where we would suddenly have a memory pop in from a past life, an experience, a different time, and something was just there instantaneously in the information and the memory field between us, in which we had to then essentially dig in and understand what that is and what's actually going on. So I formalized this method after many, many years of doing this as a novel approach to sociocultural anthropology, realizing that if you really want to know about particular time periods and particular ways of life and particular cultures, well, a lot of that knowledge and information is actually embedded in the lifetimes of the people who were there, who lived there, who experienced it, who know the truth of that experience much more clearly than we get through the understanding of history, which is, as we say, told a lot by the winners of the wars, right? And is framed by a lot of ethnocentricity. The British guys going in down to, Egypt and trying to explain how some of these sites were built without the physics knowledge to actually understand that what they're proposing is not even possible, right? And so I gathered a lot of data from these soul family networks and through experiential recall experiences, and was able to validate names and locations and planets and information, and eventually also was taking people on essentially astral travel journeys using scientific methods of remote viewing and astral travel to go to different planets and actually experience different species and different worlds and gather that information without telling people what the planet is or what it's about or what it looks like, but instead letting a group having that experience for themselves for the first time actually provide the data that I could then record and anchor down into an understanding. So this is a little bit different, right? There's a little bit different approach than what you get from a lot of the channelers out there who are like, they just went into a medicine journey or went into their own, super deep meditation state, channeled some information, or had a being tell them this is how it is, or this is what it is. And my challenge with that is that while I think that can be very valuable and is really the training mechanism inside of us to be able to open up to telepathic communication with other species, there's also challenges because a lot of different people that try to channel information don't have the knowledge in, let's say, physics or sociology or planetary infrastructure or how a star system actually forms and moves, the astrophysics of that. And so they get information, but they don't always know how to translate that information accurately. And so my goal has been, well, what does it take to translate these different ideas accurately? If we're going to actually study exoplanets and other planets with other species around them, we better get to know how planets evolve around stars. We better get to know the science of these things. We better get to know the physics of how they could operate and behave, and why skin color changes and why the suns of different planets engage and change species in different ways. So to begin with, I'll talk a little bit about the Syrian system, and I'm going to take us on kind of a quick fast fire tour across the galaxy. So in Sirius A and B, you have literally a planet that has two suns. And so this planet essentially has daylight most of the time, most of the year. And so there's a particular type of life that thrives in this condition. And that type of life essentially is trees. Trees love sunlight, and they grow bigger and bigger and stronger the more sunlight they're given. They also act as protectors for other forms of life that may be down in the ground underneath the boughs of the trees. And so trees and a culture built around communion with the trees, building in the trees, and understanding the language and the art and the energy of the forests is what lies at the heart of the Syrian system. So we can look at a lot of parallels of elven stories and the stories of different elven peoples and art and architecture designed around the elven mythos, and see that they plug directly into this understanding of the way that the biosphere of the Syrian system works, and a lot of the different people that I've come into contact with who remember being there, who remember living in this system and operating in these particular ways, having these particular cultures, and engaging, coming to Earth and really loving and feeling the connection with Gaia through this connection that they hold with the trees and with the magic of the forests, the beauty of nature, the desire for biomimicry and interconnectivity with nature. And how do we actually learn from this Gaian academy that is the Earth of how we can be in greater harmony with the planet? And of course, a lot of the Syrians as well developed a very powerful ability to work with light, because when you have two suns, you have to essentially learn how to filter and work with the light in order to make certain areas livable and in order to engage with appropriate biocycles and things like that. So there is a deep dive that came out of this from a dream I had back in 1997, in which I literally was dreaming I traveled towards this large school, and I flew up into the sky. And then I'm flying towards the Big Dipper, and I end up traveling through a Stargate in the Big Dipper. And I end up flying up to this planet with two suns. And I came down to this planet, and it's very Earth-like with oceans and forests and mountains. And in this field, in this very, very bright field, I found a home that was one of my homes, and this building that was essentially a dome-like observatory that I could use to see the stars even in the bright of day. And I ended up going back to this place many, many, many years later by having a memory of being with my Syrian sister when I finally realized that I wasn't from this planet a long time ago. And we were literally in this same dome observatory, essentially weaving together an energetic field between us that would enable us to feel and locate each other's souls when we left our bodies and traveled to Earth and incarnated as humans or human hybrids here on planet Earth back in the age of Atlantis, during the Ice Age, before the ice broke, before the floods happened. And so this was a key for me that I had to then unfold and understand. And when I had that dream, that was in my high school days, I went immediately and looked up dual sun system online. And what I got was the Dogon tribe, who literally tell stories about these dolphin-like beings who came and created pools in the ground and swam over them and told them about this planetary system that they had traveled through, and told them some about the Dogon's mythology and etc. And those of you that know the story know that the Dogon actually had illustrated on their cave wall the exact rotation of Sirius A and B and the travel of Sirius A and B. And literally the rotational structure of these two stars wasn't verified in astronomy until the 80s. And it was one of these astronomers who came across this Dogon tribal diagram and realized, my God, they knew the exact rotation between these two stars. And it's absolutely phenomenal to think of the implications of that. And that in fact, maybe the Dogon stories about being greeted by star beings was true. I also happened to be writing a whole presentation at the time in high school on Tolkien. And I learned from all of these old books about Tolkien and his own writings, biographical and autobiographical, that essentially he wasn't an author, he was a linguist. And he was essentially trying to create a new language. And he started to have visions as he created that language, telling the story of a species from a land of eternal sun who crossed the great seas and came to Middle Earth. And this was the story of the elves. And he said personally that his stories were his best efforts of translating the history of another world and other beings. And so we know that somehow in The Lord of the Rings, there are these threads of truth that Tolkien was able to bring through from some of these different species. Now, we also have a connection to the Tuatha De Danann, who essentially are my own ancestors. I'm half Irish. My ancestry goes all the way back in Ireland, very, very old. And essentially, the Tuatha De Danann were said to have originated from 3 islands in the sky. They showed up basically on the shores of the British Isles, riding clouds, carrying with them 4 sacred treasures from 3 islands in the sky. Now, what would be islands in the sky? You know, where are the islands in the sky around the earth? And so essentially this elven fae-like culture were revealing this connection they have to these different planetary worlds. And I think in particular, most strongly, the Syrian system. And these sacred treasures, the Stone of Fall, Spear of Luk, Cauldron of Dagda, and the Sword of Light of Nuada are essentially deep within our cultural mythology. The Sword of Light of Nuada eventually was called Caliburn, and then later Excalibur. If we look at fire, air, earth, water, spirit, the tarot cards, the symbols of the playing card deck, all of these point to these same 4 elements and deep archetypal knowledge and wisdom about the nature of matter and the nature of creation, going all the way back to our understandings of gravity earlier. So there's tons more I could share on that, but I will now take us on a few more jaunts across the galaxy to the Pleiades, where those who come from this world remember and are deeply connected to the ocean and this powerful ocean planet, and a very different biosphere in a sense than the very Earth-like planet that we're used to. Think much more like Waterworld with little island chains and star temples and things like that, but that exist on a planet that is mostly primarily covered in water. And in my communication with the Pleiadians, they've shared with me that this major mother planet where a lot of their species evolved from is in the Maya system. And we actually call the star Maya, and Maya means mother, nurse, great one, the fertility spring. It's connected to the month of May. So we're already honoring this star system all the time, every year in our sort of May magic and May Day. And the stars in the Pleiadian system are young, as stars go. And essentially, these young stars are very bright blue. And you have to think about essentially the fact that your body is designed to match and receive the light frequencies from our star. It's designed to match so that you can receive the particular frequencies of our star, and our planet and our species on this planet are also aligned to those frequencies. And this opens up the wisdom of how are these beings blue skinned, or many of them at least. And of course they have white skin and there's other skins as well. But essentially the root species is connected to these blue stars and the blue nebula that they inhabit within. Anytime you look at a picture of the Pleiades, you can see the resonance coming in there and the power of the archetype of water as well, which is interesting because it's like centers right around these transmissions of this water planet. The Pleiadians are also deeply connected to sound and music, to vibrating each other's bodies. And that would also connect to this water planet theorem, because essentially you're going to learn how to vibrate water and work with water in different ways, get water to do what you want as part of your main technological arc and progression. And so in my own personal experience over the years with accessing my Pleiadian memories, I essentially remembered growing up on an island chain and getting of age. And eventually I learned how to sing to the ocean, and you learn how to walk out onto the ocean. And this is after lots of connection with cetaceans, the dolphins and the whales, learning how to engage with different sea life and having different experiences. I walked out onto the ocean and I had to walk to the horizon as part of the initiation. And when I got out on the horizon, I came to this temple floating above the water. And I climbed into this temple and went inside. And essentially, it wasn't a big space. I came to the edge of this platform, and in front of me was a hole going down into the ocean. And the ocean was swirling in this intense maelstrom-like vortex that went down as far as the eye could see, just into blackness. And I'm standing in this space that has an upper ring, and there are actually beings in robes in blue up on this ring looking down at me, but I can't see their faces. They're just standing there watching me. And there's no instructions. There's no idea what to do next. And essentially, I realized that what I had to do was take a leap of faith to actually step off of this platform into this abyss. And I didn't have any other real choice or other option. I could go back, but I took the leap of faith and I stepped off the platform. And as soon as I did, I was held in this gravitational field. And suddenly water came up around me and formed this like suit-like egg around me. And it got brighter and brighter light as the top of this temple opened up. And I was shot out of the temple, careened across the galaxy, like out of the atmosphere. And I'm flying above the planet. And I see these massive ships and smaller ships cruising around, flying around, taking a look at me as I'm shooting towards this one massive, huge, beautiful blue ship. And I come to this ship and I go into the side of this one tunnel and I shoot up the tunnel and I come out into this massive pavilion space. And all the water falls off around me and then is like absorbed or drained into the floor somehow. And there's beings walking around like me, but that are older and wearing really interesting, outfits and costumes and galactic ambassadorial stuff. And they just nod at me and keep walking. And I'm looking at like hundreds of layers of floors inside of this atrium, this massive space, and gateways and passageways and windows looking out in space and down at the planet. And again, no instructions. Nobody tells you what to do. And this is a lot of the magic of the Pleiadian way, is the art of self-discovery, the just taking the leap of faith, the magic of a lot of the stories we hear about Christ and Christianity, the walking on water, the parting of the seas and the magic of the ocean, the connection to the leap of faith. All of these things are connected to the Pleiadian mythology. and are deeply woven in the culture of the Pleiades. And yet we have and experience them here on Earth. And there are a lot of global cultural connections, by the way, to the Pleiades, from Polynesian to the Greek mythology to Aboriginal stories about the magic of love of the Pleiadian sisters, the Kritika, the wives of the seven rishis in Hinduism, the seven star girls in Native Americans, sometimes orphan boys, and or in Japan, the symbol of Subaru, unity, coming together. It's a very, very powerful star system in many of our root origin stories across the planet, particularly Polynesian. And there's a particular connection to stories of Lemuria and prior to Atlantean civilization, the story of different cultures coming from the stars, a lot of them being Pleiadians, into the ocean-faring and seafaring cultures across the Pacific Rim. So it's interesting to note here too, as I've mentioned, Christianity's connection with the Pleiades, that we also see in tons of medieval art the story, these ships, literally like starships shining down on Jesus, or behind Mary, or like a dude in a craft up there. And I think that that's really fascinating to note in the sort of context of our sociocultural anthropological study. Motherships are also super common in the Pleiadian fleet, a lot like this one. Maybe she's pretty close to a Pleiadian, but not quite, a little bit different. But essentially the power of the voice, the sonic landscape, and where is she singing? Above a water planet, right? Floston Paradise. So there's a lot of deep interconnection here that moves through a lot of our popular culture. Now, next, we're going to go to the Arcturian system, and we're going to look a little bit at what it's like to be around a red giant star. So red light, intense heat. The surface of the planet has gone through a lot of change from the time Arcturus was a small star. And over that change, over, literally millions of years, there's been an evolution of the Arcturian species, and more of the infrastructure and the buildings of the Arcturians has gone underground into caverns. The understanding and the magic of stone as an ancestral record keeper. And so we can kind of glean insights into the Arcturian construction by different artists rendering these sort of mountain temples, and even Tolkien in his stories about the mines of Moria and these massive cities underground hearken to the Arcturian landscape and way of life. We also see a lot of Egyptian connection and Egyptian initiations, particularly the old Egyptian magic initiations of going into the places of the dark in order to find the light within thyself. Many of the Egyptian temples that still stand have initiation processes that were connected to this. And we find that for those Arcturians who are here, they tend to have a little bit of pride and sense of ownership in connection to the pyramids, because I believe, due to the transpersonal psychological work I've done and my own travels to the Arcturian system, that the pyramids are a very, very common Arcturian form of architecture for energetics, for a variety of different uses. And there seems to be a really powerful connection there. Now, another thing that's very interesting about the Arcturians that unfolded throughout my journey was the understanding of them as different geneticists and genetic weavers. And the idea that knowing what an Arcturian actually looks like now is pretty difficult, because their entire genetic history, they've been evolving and adapting their genome to different purposes, for pleasure, for joy, for the self-expression. And there are many, many ways that we see them expressed. Now, you'll notice as I point to these different species that a lot of them look humanoid and very much like us. And that is because these species are very much like us. In fact, many of them you would not be able to discern from another human if they were walking down the road. And that's what made them genetically compatible enough to incarnate into human species here on planet Earth. And essentially, a lot of the Homo sapien that we have is a merger of these different genetic lines from different galactic species across the galaxy, and in particular, the ones that I'm focusing on here. So a few more images and renders of Arcturian architecture and landscapes based on my own astral journeys and that of the many, many hundreds of colleagues that I have that have been exploring these spaces as well. And we gain glimpses more and more of these parts of ourselves as we get to know who we are and what we resonate with and what's actually going on inside of us and where that knowledge comes from and where that wisdom comes from. So now I'll go to one that you probably haven't heard as much of, the Ahonian system. The Ahonian system, essentially the closest analog we have to this planetary system in our cultural mythology, is the planet Dagobah in Star Wars. The planet Dagobah being covered with jungle and marsh and heavy rains and very wet is a really good biospheric match to the Ahonian system, where a lot of the culture has thus evolved around the stance that life is medicine and that in fact all life is teaching us in different ways. And all life has things to show us and ways to enhance our lives and improve our lives. And essentially, we can see through both astral travel and the Ahonian system and a lot of the Ahonian friends of mine that I have from this world, that this very deeply interconnected culture with nature rides on the edge of like indigenous rawness and very, very, very deep cultivation of rootsy connection to the planet, to the medicines of the planet, and the ways that life evolves on a planet. I personally had memory in being in the Ahonian system and being taught how to use a tree as a method of enhancing the astral body for travel. And the Ahonians were able to essentially use the tree as a vehicle and then astrally travel using the information network of the tree as like assisted perception field and go around the galaxy and eventually go and meet different species who are capable of seeing and interacting with their astral bodies. And then those species learned about the Ahonians and were invited to come and visit the Ahonians. And when they did, the Ahonians knew they were coming, they greeted them and brought them gifts of different medicines and different foods and different gifts from their planet. And this was one of the first real bridges of the Ahonian species becoming part of the galactic community. While resistant in some ways to certain forms of higher technology, the Ahonians eventually adapted technology into their own ways of staying deeply connected to their culture and connected to their planet. Some of these outfits created by artists here and this symbol on the forehead, tattooing on the forehead and things like that are a very Ahonian cultural formula. And so we see some connection to the Ahonian cultures in these art forms. Also, the pyramids in Mexico and throughout the Yucatan are actually similarly designed to the design of the temples of the Ahonian peoples. And we can see the roots of things like ayahuasca and the connection to the deep jungle energy that showed up in the Yucatan as a connection here as well. And also throughout the Amazon, because in the Amazon, we have all of these artists and ayahuasqueros, medicine keepers, who've somehow found out of 40,000 plant species how to make these particular medicines. And they say very clearly, this information came from star nations. And in a lot of the art of the ayahuasqueros and the stories of the ayahuasqueros, they just take it part and parcel that our galactic family and star nations are a deep part of the communion and the growth and the evolution of that species. Next, I'll talk a little bit about the Shiheili and the Shiheilian system based in the Orion constellation. The primary Shiheili evolution occurred on an Earth-like planet and then also on a desert planet nearby. And a lot of the interaction and the growth of the Shiheili happened from the experience on these two worlds. However, during the Orion Wars, the Earth-like planet was nearly destroyed. So the culture now in general is mainly formulated around the desert planet and the culture that has evolved and emerged from that. The ability to understand and work with the preciousness of water. For those of you that have seen the new Dune movie, there's some interesting, a few keys there that look and point to the Shiheili way of life, but it's a little bit more like Oriental culture. Think of galactic samurai, so to speak, and a lot of the Oriental culture and Taoism in particular on planet Earth is said in some of the ancient scrolls to have come from teachers in the stars. And it is my assessment based on my studies and sociocultural anthropology work, personal experience and memories, and my connection with many, many other Shiheili, that in fact, a lot of the roots of the Taoist and the Oriental culture go back to the Shiheili star system. And there is a deep communion with that culture in the way that we live and behave on this planet. And so, in this star system, what's happened on this desert planet is that there's both a lot of this magic on the surface built into these mountain ranges, white cities, and beautiful temples. But then under the ground, there's crystalline structures and another world entirely, a world where there's water, where plants grow, life grows, and a lot of the cultivation that occurs from the species happens underground and in these deep, beautiful, crystalline, and bioluminescent caverns. Here's one more shot of that and a little bit of example of Shiheili culture, red, white, and black, very strong cultures for the Shiheili. And as I mentioned, there is a deep connection here with Oriental samurai on Earth, with Taoism out of Japan, the understanding that in the ancient lineages and scrolls, there are all of these wisdoms that come from different star nations and are mapped to different star points in the body, that we, in a sense, are a memory storage unit for the galaxy. And one of my friends that was working in a monastery in the Himalayas said they were pulling out these ancient scrolls from some of the deepest crypts and essentially translating some of this knowledge that came from Star Nation connection to how to do higher and deeper levels of alchemy and actually understand the nature of space-time on Earth. Now, there's also a connection here with Tibetan Buddhism and the Shiheili, but a lot of the Tibetan texts literally just point to advanced astronomical diagrams, planetary orbits and locations, and a lot of the connection and the knowledge about these particular places has been lost. Now, I won't get into it too much, but the Shiheili's planet that was destroyed essentially in the Orion Wars happened because of these guys. And there is a little key that I talk about in some of my other talks, which is that essentially these guys were essentially genetic hybrids of humanoids and dragons. And dragons from the Andromeda galaxy had their DNA stolen. That DNA was then used to create these reptilian hybrids. And the experiment, let's just say, went really wrong. And a lot of the old dragon lords were angered deeply by having their genetic line stolen, having some of their grandfathers dying and being born into another galaxy as they followed the genome line. And so came to this galaxy incarnated as some of this reptilian species and wanted to destroy and wipe out the other humanoids. But then there were those like me, myself, and many of my friends and my soul family who were also dragons, who realized the beauty of this amazing species in the Milky Way galaxy. And we decided to learn about those species and then incarnate as those species on planets that were going to be close enough to this reptilian wave of armies that started assaulting different areas of the galaxy to try to stop that war and stop those assaults and essentially end that conflict. But, it's a longer story that I can tell right now to get into all of the different parts of that experience. But I do teach about it and I do talk about it as one of the deepest healings that our galaxy has gone through and is still going through in some ways here as our souls have evolved and are incarnated on Earth and are still dealing with some of these issues around honor, around having, basically believing that we're better or worse than each other, learning that, we're all in a learning journey and we're all in a growth arc together. And so here's some of my Shiheili family, some of my Solarian brothers. And I think that I'm about out of time. So I think I might leave it at that. Joan, have you come on to tell me I'm complete?
I don't want to tell you you're complete, to be perfectly frank.
You've just begun, brother.
It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Excellent.
This is
That was a
so
good tour.
fascinating.
I just wanted to take them on a nice tour across the galaxy for some planets and species. I feel complete in that. And thank you guys so much for having me in this epic adventure.
Wow, we
Thank
should
you
do
so
a
much,
whole
man.
day.
Our hearts.
Let's do a
Yeah.
whole day with Adam.
You know, I'm starting a mystery series, School on Portal to Ascension, in about the end of the year, where I'm going to get a few speakers to do deep dives, 1 to 2 day retreats. Let's talk,
nice.
Adam. I think
Okay.
I would love to go way deep into some of these topics, like over 2 days with you.
That sounds awesome. That sounds like
Mhm.
fun. I haven't done a retreat in a long time. That could be a blast.
Yeah, excellent production and graphics and explanation. It was
Thank
really
you.
a great tour of our local galaxy, so I appreciate it too.
Thank
And,
you.
I
I'll
love
talk to you,
that
Adam.
you've been to all these places, and I've met them all personally, Adam, and you're so graphic in the descriptions. It brings them to life.
Thank you so much,
I can
Joan.
see it.
I'm
It
honored.
helps me so much.
You know, it makes a huge difference for me. You know, putting energy into these talks, taking people on these journeys, and you don't have feedback live, right? It's the challenge. You can't see people light up, but I can tell you that the amount of people that I've had come up to me afterwards and go, "Oh my God, thank you. I just realized that I'm from this star system, and like something just unlocked inside of my being." It's such a beautiful experience. And I think that's a lot of the work that we're all doing here is we're actually just helping people remember who they are and just ask the right questions to find their own gift in this universe.
Right. And we're more than just the conventional series of ETs that we talk about, you know, Pleiadians, Arcturians, and all that. So I love that you, because that's been my question for the whole time I really got into all this is why do we blanket statement a whole entire star system or 7 stars with one name, you know? Right. So you took it a little further, but before we let you go, I want to ask you one question about the Shiheili. Okay. Yeah. So you said that there was 2 planets and one, you know, was a desert planet. And then after the Orion Wars, these beings basically started inhabiting the desert planet. So I'm wondering, how does that work with the construct of time? Like, do they live within this dimension and it's linear time? Therefore, it's in their past that this planet was desolated during these wars? Or so do they still, even if they're not in this dimension, experience reality linearly?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's, you know, just to step back contextually first, I'll just say that every species I'm talking about evolved on a planet, is physical, you know, has physical ships, has genetics, you know, biology, has been imprinted by their star, you know, still maintain their planet. Like, I'm talking about physical beings, you know, and while there are a couple species, and one I was going to talk about briefly, but didn't get to, that have essentially evolved to the point of being able to become physical and non-physical at will, like the Laquinanwininawnwinea. It's, you know, it's difficult to just study the non-physical beings because then you have the astral library. I mean, literally there's infinite kinds of astral expressions of beings in the spirit world and in the different planes of existence. But I think it grounds it a bit to say, let's talk about this planet, you know, and this planet and this star system that you can actually point to, that we can travel to later, you know. And for the Shiheili, like they just had in their solar system, you can think of it as like Earth and Mars, like close enough planets, both within the range where they could have biospheres. And the Earth-like planet was rich and wet, and they developed the technology to essentially just travel between the 2 planets, and did that regularly. And then when the assault forces of the reptilians came in, they came in and hit the Earth-like planet first. And it was so quick and it was so intense that just turned into tons of slave camps and decimation and massive mining operations and shipbuilding operations. And a lot of the Shiheili, including my own family, retreated to the desert planet. And I was just a kid at the time, and had to basically defend this desert planet from ongoing assaults. But the biosphere was so harsh on the reptilian genetics that it was really difficult for them to even be there, let alone attack the cities. And so it was able to stand as a refuge until a certain period of time when we could get galactic assistance and actually end the battles on those planets for good. But that's all a long story, but I like to talk about it because there's a lot of our trauma, I think, still a lot of people and beings still have trauma from having their planet destroyed. And that kind of experience is not something you shake from a soul easily, even after 20,000 years or 30,000 years,
Right.
And so
the traumas
we don't even know what
experience,
happened.
keep it going. The earth traumas keep that deep trauma intact.
What do you think?
Living out our traumas with
And
amnesia.
we don't even know. It's all our secret history that we don't even know that we have these galactic traumas, let alone our earth trauma.
Yeah.
And
Fantastic.
you're like a cosmic anthropologist there, cultural anthropologist.
Doing my best.
Basically, yeah.
But just think how many different types of cultures Earth has, and tracking that across the galaxy, it's almost infinite. Not quite, but it's.
Yeah, I mean, I do in one of my talks, the Ancient Future talk I did for, I think, Conscious Life or something. I get into all of these different cultures on Earth and then pointing to the stars. And a lot of them have overlaps with the species I was talking about. But then there are some that, I don't know what species they point to because they're so vast. Right. But we can say that at least a lot of the beings that brought a lot of their culture to this planet, a lot of them were also choosing to come incarnate on this planet too. So the souls actually migrated here. And that makes it a little easier to define. And it means that their bodies are a little more compatible genetically and otherwise. So we can track that a bit. But yeah, I mean, this is an endless space of work and research to explore. And we'll only really get the confirmations when we actually make a contact, when you have contact experience, or you get in a ship and you go to those planets. And we will, but trying to prime people a bit.
I mean, I know Neil loves this kind of stuff. He's been tracking it himself. So it's really exciting work.
Oh, yeah, I'm definitely excited. Well, before we let you go, there's one more question from Jeffrey in the audience. So let's see if we can just answer this really quickly. He's saying that in a lot of images you showed, there was armor and weapons. Are there peaceful and harmonious systems without war that you're aware of?
Once a species develops a certain level of capacity, everything is just style. It's not like, for example, I don't get into sword battles anymore these days, like in this lifetime. Although I have played with it some, but essentially it's just for joy and for fun and for my own memory and for who I am that I have a collection of swords. And do I like the style of wearing a pauldron? Yeah, I do, but not because I'm trying to defend myself from someone attacking me with a blade, but because it reminds me about who I am. And so for species like the Shiheili, it's just baked into their culture to wear, outfits and armor and certain things in certain ways to help represent who they are. And I don't think other than the Shiheili, I mean, maybe the Arcturians, he's talking about the chick with the metal outfit on. It didn't seem like armor to me. So I don't know which other ones I pointed to that may have had armor, maybe some of the elven pictures. But again, I'm doing my best to take bits of artwork created by different artists and when I can track down the artist and find the artwork that matches the transpersonal psychological story and the socioculture anthropology stories, and that fit it together to help communicate the ideas. So they're not all perfect. Forgive me.
Beautiful, bro. Adam, thank you so much, man. Always appreciate you. And you're just so amazing. Thank you for being here and contributing your energy.
Thank you so much, Neil. It's an honor. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Alan.